Welcome to another deep dive. This time we're going to be exploring what it means to be a highly sensitive person, especially when it comes to relationships. You shared some fascinating chapters from Elaine Aron's book, The Highly Sensitive Person. So let's unpack those, shall we? Chapters 5, 6, and 7, if I remember correct.
Yeah. Those chapters really zero in on the HSP experience.
Yeah.
Like social settings, at work, and then those close personal relationships.
Okay, so one thing that really struck me, like right off the bat, was how Aaron distinguishes between like introversion and sensitivity.
Yeah.
It's easy to think they're like the same thing, right?
Yeah.
All sensitive people must be hiding from parties.
Right. Like they all hate parties. That's a super common misconception. It's important to remember that while all highly sensitive people share that, like deep processing trait, only about 70% of them are introverts.
Okay.
The other 30% are actually extroverted.
So someone could be like the life of the party, but still be highly sensitive underneath it all.
Exactly. For them, it's not about like avoiding social interaction. It's about how intensely they're experiencing it.
Yeah.
That 30% might love parties,
Right.
but they'll likely need some serious downtime afterwards to, recover from all the stimulation.
That makes a lot of sense. So if our listener's thinking, wait, I'm sensitive, but I love meeting new people, that doesn't mean they're not a HSP.
Right. It's not a one-size-fits-all label. What's important is how you relate to the world around you. Do you find yourself easily overstimulated by things like bright lights, loud noises, strong emotions? Do you need more time to process information and make decisions? These are the kinds of questions that can help you understand your own sensitivity.
Yeah, that's a good point. And speaking of how HSPs relate to the world, one of the things Aron dives into is how differently HSPs, especially introverted ones, approach social situations. There's some fascinating research by Avril Thorne that you had highlighted.
Yeah, Thorne's work, it really sheds light on the strengths that introverted HSPs bring to social interactions. They might not be the ones dominating the conversation, but they're the ones truly listening. And that depth of listening allows them to offer like really insightful advice, often after careful consideration.
It's not just about being quiet, but about having that deeper level of engagement.
Precisely. Thorne found that while extroverts might jump into problem solving with the first idea that comes to mind, introverted HSPs take their time. They weigh different perspectives. They consider potential consequences.
Wow.
And then they offer solutions that are well thought out and often surprisingly innovative.
It's like they're the strategists, like the ones working behind the scenes, which actually reminds me of another idea that Aron brings up, the royal advisor archetype.
Yes. This is where it gets really fascinating.
Yeah.
Aron suggests that HSPs throughout history have often naturally fallen into these advisory roles. Think of figures like Merlin from the King Arthur legends.
Oh, yeah.
They were the ones on the front lines, but they were the ones with the wisdom and foresight to guide those in power.
That's such a powerful image. So instead of viewing their sensitivity as a weakness, we can see it as this valuable trait that allows them to navigate complex situations with a different kind of intelligence.
Exactly. And this reframing is especially important when we consider how HSPs navigate the working world. It's not always easy for them to thrive in those traditional fast-paced environments where sensitivity isn't always valued.
Yeah. And that's where Aron's discussion of vocation really resonated with me.
Yeah.
She talks about this idea of individuation, finding that unique path that's meant for you, even if it's not the typical 9-to-5 grind.
Yes, and she ties this concept back to Joseph Campbell's famous line, "Follow your bliss." It's not about seeking the easiest path.
Right.
It's about discovering what truly lights you up, what feels deeply fulfilling, even if it's challenging or unconventional.
This really speaks to the idea that HSPs might need to be a bit more intentional about choosing careers that allow them to use their sensitivity as a strength. So instead of trying to fit into a mold that doesn't work, it's about carving out your own space.
Absolutely. Think about fields where empathy, deep thinking, and a nuanced understanding of the world are truly valued, like counseling, writing, research, the arts. These are just a few examples, but the key is to find that sweet spot where your sensitivity becomes an asset rather than a liability.
So for a listener, this could be a moment to reflect on their own career path. Does your current work allow you to tap into those strengths, or are you constantly feeling drained and depleted?
Right, and if you're feeling that mismatch, what steps could you take to move toward a more fulfilling path?
Yeah.
That might be a gradual shift, maybe exploring new skills or side projects, or it might be a more radical change.
Yeah.
But the key is to be honest with yourself about what you truly need. and to start taking those steps toward a work life that feels more aligned with who you are.
And remember, you don't have to have all the answers right now. It's a journey of self-discovery. Even just starting to ask those questions can be a powerful first step.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about how sensitivity plays out in social situations and in the workplace. Now let's dive into the realm where it can get really intense romantic relationships. Erin's research suggests that HSPs might actually fall in love harder, and she breaks down a few reasons why.
Yeah. One factor she highlights is something she calls rebound intensity.
Now, I think we've all experienced that feeling of heightened emotions after a period of isolation or a breakup.
Right.
But for HSPs, it sounds like it can be amplified.
Exactly. Because HSPs process emotions so deeply, the contrast between solitude and that sudden rush of connection can be even more pronounced.
Yeah.
So that initial stage of falling in love can feel incredibly intense, almost overwhelming.
And thinking about our listener, if there's someone who tends to fall hard and fast, this knowledge could be really helpful. It's okay, I understand why I feel things so intensely, and now I can be more mindful about how I navigate those early stages of a relationship.
Right. It's about recognizing your own patterns and potentially putting some safeguards in place. Maybe taking things slower, communicating your needs clearly, or having those honest conversations with yourself about whether this intensity is sustainable in the long run.
So it's not about trying to dampen those feelings, but about being aware of them and making conscious choices about how you want to proceed.
Exactly. And this brings us to another important point, that Aron raises the potential connection between self-esteem and relationship choices.
Because HSPs are often told, they're too sensitive, they can sometimes internalize that message and struggle with self-worth, right?
Unfortunately, that's quite common. And when you're coming from a place of low self-esteem, any form of acceptance or validation can feel incredibly powerful, even if it's coming from someone who might not be a good match for you long term.
So it's almost like that craving for connection can lead to settling for less than you deserve.
That's a risk, for sure. That's why Aron really emphasizes the importance of working on your self-worth before diving headfirst into a relationship. When you feel good about yourself, you're less likely to seek validation from external sources and more likely to choose partners who truly align with your values and needs.
Makes total sense. It's about recognizing your own worthiness and knowing that you deserve to be with someone who celebrates your sensitivity, not someone who tries to diminish it.
Right.
And speaking of seeking validation, Aron also talks about this tendency for HSPs to project their spiritual yearnings onto a partner, almost mistaking the human for the divine.
Yeah.
This part really intrigued me. It's
Yeah.
that deep longing for connection can become so intense that it gets projected onto a specific person, making them seem like the answer to all your prayers.
It's a fascinating blend of psychology and spirituality. Aron even connects it back to Carl Jung's ideas about the anima and the animus. These are basically archetypes representing the unconscious masculine and feminine energies within each of us.
Okay, now that sounds a bit complex. Could you break that down a bit more for our listener?
Sure. So imagine that we all have both, masculine and feminine energies within us, regardless of our gender.
Okay.
And we're all seeking that sense of wholeness, that feeling of completion. But for HSPs, that longing might be even more intense, and they might mistakenly believe that a romantic partner can fulfill that void.
So it's like putting all your eggs in one basket, expecting one person to fulfill all your needs, which of course can be a recipe for disappointment.
Right. That's why it's so important to do that inner work first, to get to know yourself, explore your own depths, and cultivate that sense of wholeness within yourself. Then you can approach relationships from a more grounded and realistic place.
And speaking of approaching relationships realistically, Aron also brings up the impact of childhood experiences, particularly through the lens of attachment theory.
Right. Attachment theory explores how our early relationships, especially with our primary caregivers, shape our patterns of reloading as adults.
So if someone had an insecure attachment in childhood, maybe they were consistently neglected or their needs weren't met, that could show up in their romantic relationships later on.
Exactly. They might find themselves constantly seeking reassurance, fearing abandonment, or even pushing people away to avoid getting hurt.
And for HSPs, with their heightened sensitivity, those attachment wounds could be even more impactful.
That's a good point. So for our listener, it might be helpful to reflect on their own attachment style.
Yeah.
Do they tend to be anxious in relationships, constantly seeking reassurance? Or do they find themselves pulling away when things get too close?
Because understanding your own attachment patterns can give you so much insight into your relationship dynamics and any recurring challenges you might be facing.
Right. It's not about blaming your past, but about recognizing how it might be influencing your present,
Hi.
taking steps to heal those wounds. And therapy can be an incredibly valuable tool for that process.
Okay, so we've talked about these individual factors that can influence how HSPs experience love. Now let's look at the actual dynamics of HSPs in different relationship scenarios.
Okay.
One scenario Aaron explores is what happens when you have two HSPs in a relationship.
Ah, interesting.
That sounds like it could be like either incredibly fulfilling or a recipe for disaster. What does Aaron say about this?
Well, on the positive side, you have that potential for like deep understanding and empathy.
Mm-hmm.
They just get each other on a level that others might not. They share that sensitivity. They understand the need for downtime. They appreciate each other's nuances.
But I can also imagine that it could be a lot, especially if they're both introverts. It's like, how much space is enough space? Where do you draw the line between supporting each other's sensitivity and becoming too isolated from the world?
Yeah, that's a great point. It's all about finding that balance, isn't it? That sweet spot between connection and solitude, both as individuals and as a couple.
And it probably takes a lot of communication, being like really honest about their needs and finding ways to honor both their like shared sensitivity and their individual differences.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember that even within the HSP community, there's a lot of variation.
Oh, yeah.
Two HSPs might have very different needs and preferences.
Right.
So communication is key.
Now, what about the other scenario when an HSP is in a relationship with a non-HSP? I'm guessing that can be a bit more challenging.
It certainly can present its own set of challenges, but it can also be a beautiful and fulfilling dynamic.
So what are some of the potential pitfalls that Aaron highlights?
One of the biggest risks is that the HSP might feel misunderstood or overwhelmed. If the non-HSP partner isn't aware of the, nuances of sensitivity, they might unintentionally say or do things that trigger those feelings of overwhelm or hurt.
Like maybe they plan a big, loud surprise party thinking they're being thoughtful, but the HSP ends up feeling completely drained and overstimulated.
Exactly. Or they might try to, fix the HSP's sensitivity, telling them to, toughen up or not be so dramatic, which can be incredibly invalidating.
So communication and education are key here.
Right.
The HSP needs to feel comfortable explaining their needs, and the non-HSP needs to be open to learning and adapting.
Right. And it's important to remember that it's not about one person changing who they are, but about finding ways to bridge those differences and create a dynamic that works for both of them.
And on the flip side, what are some of the potential benefits of this kind of pairing?
Well, one of the great things about having different personality types in a relationship is that you can complement each other's strengths. The HSP might bring that depth of empathy and emotional intelligence, while the non-HSP might bring a more, grounded, practical perspective.
It's like they each bring something unique to the table and they can learn from each other.
Exactly. And if the non-HSP partner truly values and appreciates the HSP's sensitivity, it can be a really beautiful thing. They can provide that sense of stability and support, while the HSP can help them connect with their own emotions on a deeper level.
So it's about recognizing that different doesn't mean bad.
Mm-hmm.
It's about finding ways to appreciate those differences and create a relationship that honors both people's needs.
Absolutely. And this leads us to another interesting dynamic that Aron talks about, the specialization trap.
Tell me more about that.
It's this tendency for couples over time to fall into very, defined roles.
Okay.
One person becomes the emotional one, the one who handles all the feelings and the deep conversations.
Right.
The other becomes the practical one, the one who takes care of the logistics and the day-to-day stuff.
And I'm guessing this can happen in any relationship, but it might be even more pronounced for HSPs.
Right, because HSPs are often, naturally drawn to that emotional realm. They might find themselves taking on more of that role, especially if their partner is less comfortable with those kinds of conversations.
So it can start out feeling like a natural division of labor, but over time it can become unbalanced and even lead to resentment.
Exactly. And this is where communication and awareness are so important.
Yeah.
It's about checking in with each other regularly, making sure that both people feel heard and supported, and being willing to adjust those roles as needed.
Because the thing is, we're constantly evolving and growing, right? What works for us in one stage of life might not work in another.
And those midlife transitions can be especially tricky.
Right.
That's when a lot of people start to question those, ingrained roles and crave a bit more balance.
So for our listener, this is a good reminder to take stock of their own relationship dynamics. Do they feel like they're constantly carrying the emotional weight? Are they neglecting parts of themselves because they've fallen into that caretaker role?
And if so, what steps can they take to create a more equitable and fulfilling dynamic? It might involve having some honest conversations with their partner, setting some boundaries, or even seeking out individual therapy to explore those patterns more deeply.
Okay, so we've talked about these broader relationship patterns. Now let's get into something that can be particularly challenging for HSPs, and that's conflict.
Yeah, conflict can be tough for anyone, but for HSPs with their heightened sensitivity to emotional intensity, it can feel especially overwhelming.
Right, it's like their nervous system is just more attuned to those feelings of tension and discord, so arguments can quickly escalate into feeling like a major threat.
Exactly. And this is where Aaron offers some really valuable tools for navigating conflict in a way that feels safe and manageable.
One of the tools she emphasizes is the power of timeouts. Now, I used to think timeouts were just for kids,
Uh-huh.
but for HSPs, it makes so much sense. It's not about avoiding the issue, but about giving yourself permission to step away and regulate your emotions when things get too heated.
Precisely. It's about recognizing that you can't engage in productive communication when your nervous system is in overdrive.
Yeah.
You need to give yourself that space to calm down, process your feelings, and come back to the conversation with a clearer head.
And this is something you can even communicate to your partner beforehand. Like, hey, I know we need to talk about this, but I'm feeling really overwhelmed right now. Can we take a break and come back to it in an hour?
Exactly. It's about setting those boundaries and
Mhm.
creating that safe space for healthy communication.
And another tool that Aron highlights is something called positive meta communication. Can you explain what that means?
It's basically about using language during a conflict to reassure your partner that, even though things are difficult right now, the foundation of your relationship is still strong.
So it's like saying, I know this is hard, but I love you and I want to work this out with you.
Exactly. It's about reminding each other that you're on the same team, even when you're disagreeing.
And for HSPs who might be particularly sensitive to conflict escalation, those reassurances can be incredibly grounding. It's
Yeah.
like, okay, even though we're having this heated argument, we're still connected. We still care about each other.
Right. It helps to create that sense of safety and prevent things from, spiraling out of control.
And then, of course, there's the classic tool of reflective listening, which is about truly hearing and acknowledging your partner's perspective, even if you don't agree with it.
hmm Reflective listening is more than just nodding your head and saying, uh-huh. It's about actively trying to understand where your partner is coming from, reflecting their feelings back to them to make sure you're on the same page.
And Aaron gives some really helpful examples in the book of how to do this effectively. Like, instead of just saying, I hear you, you might say something like, it sounds like you're feeling really hurt because of what I said. Is that right?
Exactly. It's about demonstrating that you're truly listening and trying to understand their experience, which can go a long way in de-escalating a conflict.
And for HSPs who might be particularly attuned to their partner's emotions, reflective listening can be a powerful tool for building empathy and connection. It's like saying, I see you, I hear you, and I care about how you feel.
And even if you don't agree with their perspective, that validation can go a long way in creating a more harmonious dynamic.
Okay. So we've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our deep dive.
Yeah. We've explored what it means to be an HSP, how sensitivity can show up in social interactions in the workplace, and we've started to delve into the complex world of HSPs and romantic relationships.
And for our listener, I hope this has provided some valuable insights and maybe even some aha moments about their own experiences.
And as we continue this deep dive, we'll explore even more nuances of HSP relationships, including communication styles, conflict resolution, and finding that balance between intimacy and independence. So far, we've really been focusing on the individual HSP and relationships. But I'm curious, what does Aron say about the broader dynamics between HSPs and non-HSPs?
Ooh, that's a great question. It's easy to get caught up in the individual experience, but relationships are like a two-way street. Aron actually dedicates a significant part of the book to how these different sensitivities can play out in couples.
One thing that really stood out to me was her discussion of the specialization trap, which we touched on earlier.
Right, where couples fall into these almost stereotypical roles. One's the feeler, the other's the doer. Aron argues this gets amplified for HSPs.
Exactly. Because HSPs are often so attuned to emotions, they might naturally gravitate towards being the emotional caretaker in the relationship. And if their partner is less comfortable with feelings, they might be happy to let the HSP handle that side of things.
So at first, it seems like a perfect fit, right? Everyone's playing to their strengths. But then over time, what happens?
Well, as with any rigid role, it can become stifling. The HSP might start to feel like they're carrying the emotional weight of the entire relationship, leading to resentment and burnout. And the non-HSP partner might feel like they're walking on eggshells, afraid to express their own needs or feelings for fear of, upsetting the HSP.
It becomes this self-perpetuating cycle. And if we connect this back to what we were discussing earlier about self-esteem, it could be especially problematic for HSPs who already struggle with feeling like they're too much.
Absolutely. If they're constantly taking on their partner's emotions and trying to fix everything, it can reinforce that feeling of being responsible for everyone else's well-being, which can be incredibly draining.
So what's the antidote? How can HSPs avoid falling into this trap or climb out if they're already stuck?
Well, awareness is the first step. Just recognizing that this dynamic exists can be a huge shift. From there, it's about communication. HSPs need to learn to set boundaries and communicate their needs clearly, and non-HSP partners need to be willing to step up and share the emotional load.
And this might mean having some difficult conversations, right? Because if those roles have become ingrained over time, it can be tough to break out of them.
It can be challenging, but it's essential for the health of the relationship. And remember, it's not about blaming each other, but about working together to create a more balanced and fulfilling dynamic.
And I think it's also important to acknowledge that these rules can shift over time. What worked for a couple in their 20s might not work in their 40s, for example.
That's a great point. Major life transitions like having children or going through a career change can really shake things up and make those ingrained patterns more obvious. It's a good opportunity to reevaluate and make adjustments.
So for our listener, this could be a moment to reflect on their own relationship dynamics. Do they recognize this specialization trap? Are they feeling drained or resentful? And if so, what are some concrete steps they can take to start shifting the balance?
Maybe it's having an honest conversation with their partner about how they're feeling. Maybe it's seeking out individual therapy to explore their own patterns and needs. Or maybe it's simply starting to say no more often, setting those boundaries to protect their time and energy.
These are all great suggestions, and it reminds me of something else that Aron talks about that can be incredibly helpful for HSPs, and that's the power of solitude.
Ah, yes, the importance of downtime. This is crucial for anyone, but especially for HSPs who are processing so much information and emotional energy all the time. They need those moments of quiet to recharge and reconnect with themselves.
And this can be a point of friction in relationships, right? Especially if the non-HSP partner doesn't understand that need for solitude. They might take it personally, feeling like their partner is rejecting them or doesn't want to spend time with them.
Yeah, it's easy to see how that can happen. So for HSPs, it's important to communicate this need clearly and compassionately. Explain to your partner that it's not about them, it's about you taking care of yourself so you can be fully present when you are together.
It's like saying, I love spending time with you, but I also need some time alone to process my thoughts and feelings. It's how I recharge my battery so I can be the best partner I can be.
Exactly. And non-HSP partners, this is where that empathy and understanding comes in.
Right.
Try to see things from your partner's perspective. Recognize that their need for solitude is not a reflection on you or your relationship. It's simply a part of who they are.
And in fact, supporting their need for downtime can actually strengthen the relationship. When both partners feel like their needs are being met, it creates more space for connection and intimacy.
Absolutely. And speaking of intimacy, Aron also dives into how HSPs experience love and connection on a deeper level.
Yes. This is something that really resonated with me. She talks about how HSPs are often wired for those profound, soul-nourishing relationships.
It's like they're naturally attuned to the nuances of emotional connection. They pick up on those subtle cues, those unspoken feelings that others might miss, and they crave that deep level of intimacy where they can truly be seen and understood.
And this can be both a blessing and a curse, right? Because that same sensitivity that allows for such profound connection can also make them more vulnerable to heartbreak or feeling overwhelmed by their partner's emotions.
That's the paradox of being an HSP. You feel everything so intensely, both the joy and the pain. And in relationships, That can be amplified.
So, for a listener, if there's someone who tends to fall deeply in love and experience those emotions very intensely, how can they navigate that without getting swept away or losing themselves in the process?
Well, one thing Aaron emphasizes is the importance of self-awareness, knowing your own patterns, your triggers, your tendencies. For example, if you know you tend to idealize partners early on, putting them on a pedestal, that's something to be mindful of.
It's like, okay, I'm feeling this intense rush of love, but let me take a step back and see this person for who they truly are, flaws and all.
Exactly. It's not about trying to dampen your feelings, but about bringing in a bit of that, like critical thinking, that reality check. And this also ties back to what we were discussing earlier about self-esteem. If you feel good about yourself, you're less likely to get lost in someone else.
And I imagine boundaries are also important here, right? Learning to protect your own energy and emotional well-being, even when you're deeply in love.
Absolutely. Boundaries are essential in any relationship, but especially for HSPs who can easily get overwhelmed or take on their partner's emotions. It's about knowing your limits and
Right.
communicating them clearly.
So maybe that means setting aside time for yourself, even if it's just 15 minutes a day to meditate or take a walk. Or maybe it means saying no to certain social events or activities if you know they're going to drain you.
Right. And it also means being honest with your partner about what you need. Don't be afraid to say, hey, I love you, but I need a little space right now. A healthy relationship should allow for both connection and individuality.
And speaking of healthy relationships, Anne also offers some really practical advice for HSPs who are navigating the world of dating.
Yes, dating can be a minefield for anyone, but for HSPs, it can feel especially daunting.
You know, there's that fear of being judged as like too sensitive or too
Hmm.
much, and all those like first date jitters can be amplified tenfold.
Right. So Aaron suggests being really intentional about who you choose to date and what kind of environments you put yourself in.
So maybe skip the like loud, crowded bar and opt for a cozy coffee shop instead.
Exactly. Or choose activities that allow for like deeper conversation, like going to a museum or taking a walk in nature.
And in terms of choosing partners, she encourages HSPs to look for people who value empathy, depth, and a quieter approach to life.
Right. It's about finding someone who appreciates your sensitivity, not someone who tries to change you. And that might mean having some honest conversations early on about your needs and preferences.
Like, hey, I'm an HSP, which means I tend to be more sensitive to noise and stimulation.
Mhm.
Would you be open to like quieter dates, at least in the beginning?
Exactly. It's about setting the stage for a relationship that feels safe and nurturing for both of you.
And I think this also applies to friendships, right? Surrounding yourself with people who understand and appreciate your sensitivity can make a world of difference.
Absolutely. Friendships are so crucial for HSPs as they provide that sense of belonging and support. And having even just one or two close friends who truly get you can be incredibly validating and empowering.
It's like having a safe space to be your authentic self without feeling like you need to mask or downplay your sensitivity.
And those friendships can also be a great source of strength and resilience, especially when navigating those, inevitable challenges in life. Knowing you have people you can count on, who you can be vulnerable with, can make all the difference.
Okay, so we've talked about dating and friendships. Now let's get into something that can be particularly tricky for HSPs, and that's conflict. We touched on this earlier in terms of romantic relationships, but I'm curious to hear more about Aaron's advice for, like, handling disagreements in any context.
Right. Conflict is unavoidable in life. Right. But for HSPs, it can feel like a much bigger deal. That fight or flight response can get triggered really easily, leading to feelings of overwhelm, anxiety, or even like shutting down completely.
It's like their whole nervous system is on high alert, perceiving conflict as a major threat. So what can they do to navigate these situations more effectively?
Well, one thing Aaron emphasizes is the importance of recognizing your own triggers and warning signs. What are the physical sensations you experience when you're starting to feel overwhelmed? Maybe your heart rate increases, your palms get sweaty, or you feel a tightness in your chest.
It's like having that like internal alarm system that tells you, okay, things are getting heated, I need to take a step back.
Exactly. And once you recognize those signals, you can start to develop coping mechanisms. Maybe it's taking a few deep breaths, excusing yourself to go to the bathroom for a moment, or even just asking for a pause in the conversation.
Yeah, it's about giving yourself that space to like regulate your nervous system before things escalate. And I love that Erin normalizes this need for HSPs. It's not about being weak or avoidant, it's about taking care of yourself so you can engage in a healthier way.
Right. And she also talks about the importance of assertive communication.
Uh-huh.
which is about expressing your needs and boundaries clearly and respectfully without being aggressive or passive.
Because HSPs, with their tendency towards empathy, might be more likely to prioritize the other person's feelings over their own. They might shy away from confrontation or worry about hurting someone else.
Exactly. But assertive communication is about finding that balance. It's about honoring both your own needs and the needs of the other person.
And it might feel uncomfortable at first, especially if you're not used to, like, speaking up for yourself. But with practice, it becomes easier. And Aron offers some really helpful scripts and phrases in the book that HSPs can use to start practicing the skill.
And remember, it's not about trying to win the argument or prove that you're right. It's about finding a solution that works for both people.
And sometimes that might mean agreeing to disagree. Not every conflict needs to be resolved with a clear winner and loser.
Right. Sometimes it's about finding a compromise or simply acknowledging each other's perspectives and moving on.
Okay, so we've talked about conflict resolution. Now let's shift gears a bit and talk about another area where HSPs can really shine, and that's creativity. Aron dedicates a whole chapter to this, exploring the link between sensitivity and, like, creative expression.
This is one of my favorite parts of the book.
Mm.
Aaron argues that HSPs, with their rich inner world and their heightened awareness of subtleties, often have a natural inclination towards creativity.
It's like their sensitivity acts as this antenna, picking up on all these nuances and inspirations that others might miss, and then they're able to channel that into art, music, writing, or whatever form of creative expression resonates with them.
Exactly. And she talks about how this creative process can be incredibly therapeutic for HSPs. It allows them to process their emotions, explore their inner world, and connect with something larger than themselves.
But she also acknowledges the challenges, right?
Yeah.
Because that same sensitivity that fuels their creativity can also make them more susceptible to self-doubt, perfectionism, or fear of judgment.
Yes, those inner critics can be especially loud for HSPs. So she emphasizes the importance of self-compassion and creating a safe space for creative exploration.
So maybe that means finding a supportive community of other artists or writers, or simply carving out time for yourself to create without judgment or expectations. It's about honoring that creative spark and giving yourself permission to play.
And remember, creativity doesn't have to be about producing a masterpiece. It's about the process, the joy of creating, the connection to something deeper within yourself.
And speaking of connection, Aron also talks about the unique ways that HSPs experience spirituality and their search for meaning.
This is such a fascinating topic. Aaron suggests that HSPs, with their depth of feeling and their tendency to ponder the big questions, often have a strong, spiritual inclination.
It's like they're wired to seek out those experiences that, like, transcend the everyday, whether it's through organized religion, nature, art, or simply a deep sense of awe and wonder at the world around them.
Exactly. And she talks about how this spiritual exploration can be incredibly nourishing for HSPs, providing a sense of purpose, connection, and peace.
But she also acknowledges that it can be a complex journey because HSPs might experience the world in a more mystical or intuitive way. They might question traditional beliefs or struggle to find their place within existing spiritual communities.
It's about finding what resonates with you, what feels authentic and true to your own experience. And that might mean forging your own path, blending different traditions, or simply embracing a more personal and intuitive approach to spirituality.
And this ties back to what we were discussing earlier about individuation, right? It's about honoring your unique path and finding what truly nourishes your soul.
Absolutely. And remember, spirituality doesn't have to be about grand gestures or following a set of rules. It can be as simple as cultivating a sense of gratitude, appreciating the beauty in everyday moments, or connecting with something larger than yourself through nature, music, or art.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground in this second part of our deep dive.
We've delved into the dynamics of HSP relationships, exploring the challenges and triumphs of those pairings, and we've touched on the importance of solitude, creativity, and spirituality for HSP.
And for our listener, I hope this has sparked even more insights and reflections on their own journey as an HSP.
And in our final part, we'll bring all of this together, distilling some key takeaways from the book and offering some practical tools and strategies for HSPs to thrive in all areas of their lives.
We've covered so much in this deep dive into the world of highly sensitive people, from those foundational differences between introversion and sensitivity to how those traits show up in relationships and work and even spirituality.
Yeah, it has been quite a journey, hasn't it? And I think what's so striking is how much Aaron's work encourages HSPs to not just understand themselves, but to really embrace their sensitivity.
You know, I used to think being highly sensitive was something to manage or even minimize, but Erin really flips the script. She argues that it's actually an asset, a superpower, even if you learn to harness it.
That's what makes her work so empowering. She's not saying, here's how to fit in and be less sensitive. She's saying, here's how to understand yourself better and create a life that honors your unique needs and lets your strengths shine through.
So instead of seeing sensitivity as a burden, it's about recognizing it as like a gift, one that allows for deeper connection and greater empathy and a more nuanced understanding of the world.
Exactly. And that shift in perspective can be incredibly liberating. Because when you stop trying to be someone you're not, when you embrace who you truly are, that's when you can really start to thrive.
Now, I know we've touched on a lot of different strategies and tools throughout this deep dive, but for our listener who's maybe feeling a bit overwhelmed, what are some of the key takeaways they can start implementing today? What are those small but impactful changes that can make a big difference in their lives?
Well, one thing that stands out is the importance of self-care. This is essential for everyone, but especially for HSPs, who are constantly processing so much information and emotional energy. Making time for those activities that nourish your soul, whether it's spending time in nature or reading a good book or listening to music or simply taking a long bath, those things are not luxuries, they're necessities.
It's about recognizing that you can't pour from an empty cup. You know, if you're constantly giving to others, taking on their emotions and neglecting your own needs, you're going to burn out. So prioritizing self-care is not selfish. It's actually an act of self-preservation.
Absolutely. And it doesn't have to be complicated. Even small things like taking a few minutes each day to meditate or practice deep breathing or simply sit in silence and connect with your breath can have a profound impact on your well-being.
And speaking of well-being, another key takeaway that comes up repeatedly in Erin's work is the importance of setting boundaries. This can be tough for HSPs, especially those who are naturally empathetic and tend to put others' needs before their own.
But learning to say no and to set limits on your time and energy and to protect your emotional space, these are essential skills for HSPs to thrive.
It's about recognizing that you have a right to protect your energy and well-being. You don't have to say yes to every request or attend every social event or take on every problem that comes your way.
Right. And it's okay to disappoint people sometimes. It's okay to prioritize your own needs. In fact, when you set healthy boundaries, you're actually modeling that behavior for others. You're showing them that it's okay to take care of themselves too.
And this ties back to what we were discussing earlier about communication. HSPs need to learn to communicate their needs clearly and assertively. This might involve having some difficult conversations, but it's essential for creating healthy and fulfilling relationships.
Right. And it's also about learning to recognize and honor your own intuition. HSPs often have a strong inner voice, that gut feeling that tells them when something's not right or when they need to step away from a situation.
But sometimes those inner whispers can get drowned out by the noise of the world or by the expectations of others. So it's about learning to tune in and to trust your instincts and to act on them.
And this might mean making choices that go against the grain, that challenge societal norms, or that even disappoint people you care about. But ultimately, it's about living a life that feels authentic and aligned with who you truly are.
And I think that's the biggest takeaway from Erin's work, that being an HSP is not a weakness, it's a strength. It's a gift that allows you to experience the world in a richer and deeper and more meaningful way.
And when you embrace that sensitivity, when you honor your unique needs and allow your strengths to shine through, that's when you can truly create a life that feels fulfilling and joyful.
So for our listener, I encourage you to take what resonates with you from this deep dive and start implementing it in your own life. Maybe it's starting a self-care practice or setting some boundaries or having an honest conversation with someone you care about.
And remember, it's a journey, not a destination. There will be ups and downs, moments of clarity and moments of confusion. But the more you learn about yourself, the more you embrace your sensitivity, the more empowered you'll become to create a life that truly reflects who you are.
Beautifully said. And that wraps up our deep dive into the world of highly sensitive people and how they navigate relationships. We hope you found this exploration insightful and maybe even a little bit transformative. Until next time, keep diving deep.